Welcome to the Equipping Leaders Podcast, Leader Study Series. I'm Natasha, a leader development professional and overall leadership enthusiast.
And I'm Corey, a program manager and emerging people leader, thus a leadership enthusiast.
We're doing a leader study of the TV show Z Nation, deconstructing the leaders, leadership decisions, and team dynamics of the characters on the show, to look at how leadership is all around us. And even if we're not in a position of leadership, we can still demonstrate it in our actions, responses, and in the opportunities around us.
Z Nation aired from 2014 to 2018, but if you haven't seen it yet, there will be spoilers in these episodes. In this episode, we're talking about Season 1, Episode 10, Going Nuclear, and Episode 11, Sisters of Mercy. Let's jump in.
A lot of stuff is happening for the team. I feel like I'm going to say that for every episode. But now we've got Warren back firmly in the position of leadership. The team is, did some storming, but we've come back together. Prior to the episode that we're about to talk about today, Addie and Mac kind of had like a one-off episode where she got to work through some of the things that were challenging for her. But today we're going to start with Season 1, Episode 10, Going Nuclear. So what were some of your initial takeaways?
I thought, overarching, I thought that the team was starting to perform a little bit more. I think that there were a lot of individual tasks that were given out throughout the whole of this episode, where it's like, hey, you're going to be doing this, you're going to be doing this. And they just went and were effective with that, right? And they checked back in when there were changes. But I thought that there was more autonomy from the team. They were still all moving towards the exact same goal, but you always see them all sort of moving as a group to accomplish task by task. And when they break up, when the team breaks up, either gets separated because zombies or something like that, it tends not to go well. And so I think this is the first time where the mission goes semi well, and they're operating as sort of individual entities within the team dynamic. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Agreed. And I think that also Warren, in this position that she's in now, she's so great at articulating the plan and people's role in it. And another thing that I see her doing more is explaining who Murphy is, or correcting people, usually Murphy, on the situation. And when she does it, though, she's clear and concise. She's not like, oh, well, she's like, no, this is what it is. So I know there's one point when they're walking down the street and Murphy makes a comment and she's like, nope, we're getting you to California. She's just very this is what it is. So I think that we've talked about this before, where leaders don't deal in petty things, right? They squash them. So she's not letting the pettiness of things get around, but she's also if there's something, some dissent, not even dissent, if there's confusion, she's let me fix that. And I'm going to fix it now, and I'm going to fix it quick. And the same messaging. So I think she's being very masterful about that.
Yeah, I think this also, within this episode, we get introduced to a new type of zombie, right? The glow-in-the-dark radioactive kind. So there's also this new threat, right, that's being leveraged on the team. And I think they take that in stride, right? And just okay, these things are radioactive, probably shouldn't let them touch me or stick around them too long. And that's accepted. There's not a lot of griping and complaining of oh, another thing is just too much, I can't move on. It's nope, this is just a new variable to what we already know, and they move on with that, right? And I think that's really powerful too, as the team, that they have started to just sort of go with it and accept it, and I think that's pretty good. They're rolling with the punches, as they say, and I think that's pretty neat.
Yes, almost like this secondary mission of we help people along the way, right?
Yeah.
So it's not just the get Murphy to California. Yes, that is mission number one, but also we don't let good people suffer. That's also not who we are as a team or as a group. So they needed help, we can help them. So I feel that I appreciate that that most of the episodes are just very episodic in the way where it's challenge, overcome and move on. But I think that this is also a point where the team really starts to lean into the role of we can all be helpful. We help people. That is part of what we're doing here too, because the ultimate mission is to save humanity through Murphy. And so like doing these little kindnesses and this support along the way is also super beneficial.
Yeah, that's a really great point too, because it's like don't lose sight of the bigger picture by only focusing on the bigger picture, right? If there's no humanity left to save by the time you get to California, the mission's a failure anyway. So sometimes the greater goal comes with that additional work, right? That general housekeeping, that like O&M sort of work that comes along with it. And I think the fact that they fold that into the overarching goal of moving to California, I think it's a really good reflection of how most teams work, right? It's not always new development, it's not always new business opportunities or new sales. Sometimes it's maintaining old customers and old sales, or maintaining older software. So I think that's a really kind of interesting layer that gets put on top of this, and I think that's pretty neat.
Agreed. And it really goes, so Amy Edmondson, she did a lot of work into the concept of teaming, which is where you don't really have a core team per se, but you lend your strengths to different projects within an organization. So, beneficial for a lot of reasons. Not all teams stay together. Most teams don't make it past storming. So it was just another model for people to use. And while there is in fact the core team, obviously with this, there's also this aspect of, can we lend our strengths here? And so just like in the workplace too, even if you have a core team, they're not the only people you talk to. You talk to people across the organization. You collaborate in all of these different ways, hopefully, so that you can ultimately further your own stuff. I know that I personally do that. I make relationships across the org because I'm genuinely interested in how different things work. And then if I do see a place where my programs would be a good fit and it works for those folks, I'll bring it up. But otherwise, I'm happy to just consult and have a conversation about whatever. But yeah, if I can't ignore them, if my ultimate goal is to help my entire organization achieve something, I can't just what am I moving towards? Like you said, like in this show, it's if there's no humanity left to save, the whole thing is pointless.
Yeah, I also, given the concept, right, that the nuclear reactor, the rods have to be put into the safe or scram or whatever it's called, right? Like that those all have to be done, and that you already have some individuals that have had like super high levels of exposure and are, I think that there's like that weird sort of, they know their time is almost up already anyway, so like they're willing to be more like sacrificing of that. I just think it's really neat that the team just accepts that truth, right? Like nobody's too bent, right? Like they're not letting that emotional aspect get too overwhelming. Like they're like this job still needs to be done. And so I think that like as that team is moving in and as they're trying to get that like nuclear scientists to the facility to perform that function, I think it's pretty cool that they're like nobody's too caught up on like that this is a death sentence for him. Now, again, I don't think in our real world we're going to run into that too terribly much, right? We're talking about zombie apocalypse and nuclear reactors, and if I'm forced to run around a nuclear reactor, the world's already kind of gone. But like again, even in that mindset, they don't look at it like that, right? They're like, "Oh no, this scientist needs to get up to do this. Yeah, we'll run in and kill these zombies and do that." And I don't think I would have that same level of like perseverance. Mm-hmm. And then even when it doesn't work out, he comes out, he turns, he passes away from the radiation poisoning and then turns into a zombie. There's like this moment of pause, but they still didn't forget that mission, right? Because the rods weren't lowered yet, so they still need to continue forward. And I think that it's pretty interesting because Roberta Warren, she kind of like gives that moment for the daughter to cope with the loss of her father, and then it's like, what's the next step, right? So like you've had your time, you've given you all the time we can afford in this instance. I need you to refocus, and we can come back to this later. So I think that's pretty smart of her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because sometimes people, again, like with what Roberta went through with Garnett, like you need time and space. This is not the time or the space for you to be able to do that. You'll have that time and space. You can't just keep people always running forward, but at the same time, yeah, this is not the time and space. And I think in that moment too, Doc showed really great leadership in being a thought partner with Warren, where he said, you know, who needs to go? Well, he didn't say this exactly, but it was basically like, who can do this mission, right? Who can go, who's valuable where? We're all equally valuable, but who's valuable where? And he said, you know, Warren shouldn't go because of Murphy. Like, she was the one who was going to keep driving this forward. And so he really acknowledged to in that moment, not only her leadership, but of that role of kind of like Murphy had mentioned a few episodes prior, like nobody, they're not going to listen to anybody but you. So you are the one who needs to push this. You shouldn't go in there and sacrifice, you know, radiation poisoning.
Yeah, no, and then when they find that that next like scientist that's going to be able to help, they work out that plan. And I think Roberta, she kind of like leans on 10K to be like, hey, this is a more like tactically kind of situation. What are your thoughts, right? Because you tend to be better at this sort of like physical security piece. You know, what do you think there? So like I said, there's like a lot of really great like team dynamics there where they were working really successfully as a unit. And I thought that's pretty neat.
Yes. Agreed. And I thought it was also interesting when the daughter of the initial nuclear physicist or the initial scientist, when they're trying to use the plane to get Murphy out of there, and she says, oh, actually, I don't have enough fuel. So I think it's also interesting, just the active omission that people will do to keep something else moving forward. I know you're going to make me do this if I give you the whole truth. So I'm going to omit parts of it, either because I want to stay a part of this team, I want to stay a part of this group, I want to be a part of this, and not really saying like, hey, here are all the actual like facts of something. So, I mean, that could go to, I mean, obviously that was a father-daughter relationship, very different than working relationships, but at the same time, people will omit certain things because they just kind of fall into this whole like, I don't know that they'll like that answer, or I don't know that I'll be able to do what I want to do if I give that answer.
Yeah, what I think was interesting about the daughter piece too, though, it was she didn't want to tell him that they didn't have enough fuel because it was going to the emotional response that was going to cause the father to give. And I don't, even though that was a father-daughter relationship, I don't think that's much different than some like leaders that I've dealt with in the past, where you will omit certain things because their response will be the overreaction of the response, right? So I've dealt with leaders in the past where maybe you don't bring up an issue, or maybe you don't bring up a success because of how it will be interpreted and maybe like blown out of proportion. So sometimes the success on a, you know, depending, right? I'm just going to say like a successful like test, like in a test environment, right? That the code ran successfully, that everything worked well. Sometimes some leaders, you can't tell them that everything went perfectly, because then that becomes the expectation, because they don't necessarily understand the work. And that's not always the right. So then when you say like, oh, it didn't go well, it went well last time, it should have went well this time. What did you guys do wrong? Yeah, you know, or vice versa, where it's, you know, you don't want to say that something's going bad, because then it's going to be this big, oh, well, you know, this didn't go well. We need to have this giant meeting. We need to unpack what the issue is. And nope, we don't. It just didn't go well this time. You know, like that's just, you know, you win some, you lose some. So I think that like that piece of almost being known too well, that, you know, how you'll react emotionally, positive or negative, you know, sometimes teams will omit things just because of that.
That is so interesting to me. I think you're right. Yes, absolutely. And I think it's so
Oh, I know I'm right.
I think it's so interesting when leaders don't know how to be consistent, show up consistently. So it's like that people feel like they have to tiptoe around them, you know, in what kind of information they give them. And also just like that's a complete lack of psychological safety. Like, it's not safe here to admit, to be honest, right? To admit mistakes or failures or anything like that. So that's really interesting. I've definitely seen and been in situations where I've seen very similar things to that, but it's always just so, if I think about like as a leader, my biggest fear is that I will be in a position where people have filtered information so much before it gets to me that I don't know what's going on in my organization. So in thinking about that, it's like, how do you prevent that? You know, you want to be authentic. Like there's all these things you can do. But at the same time, I think every time I hear about something like that, I just think, yeah, like that is my biggest fear. So things are going how I need to trust people, trust what they tell me. Am I showing up in a way that's consistent where I don't fly off the handle or get upset or get defensive when they tell me something that is good or negative? And just, again, not be a robot, but just be consistent with whatever it is, good, bad, and different. We're going to work through it. And we don't need to have a big meeting about it. Like you said, like you win some, you lose some. Sometimes people have great days and sometimes people have terrible days. And that isn't something that needs to be unpacked every time. But yeah, so it's just something that's super interesting where I always wonder, is the leader being consistent? Because I'll say one more thing and then I'll let you talk. I also know that we didn't really work together. We worked adjacently within a similar type org. But this individual, every time someone went to her with something that was even remotely negative, she really took it as a personal attack, but she cried. She cried hard. She cried a lot and always at work. I'm not saying no tears in the workplace. Sometimes things happen. Crying happens, right? But at the same time, it created this experience for everyone else where it was like, she was so inconsistent and so unable to control herself that it made people very scared to tell her things. And so a lot of things in their org went off the rails because they were like, I don't want to see her cry. I can't deal with her crying. She's going to yell and then and so people just would distance themselves from it. So sorry, what you said just brought up all that stuff. I'm going to stop talking now.
I'm sorry to have brought that up for you.
I was triggered and I needed to say some things.
Well, no, back to the show Z Nation. There was, so I think, so they found that second scientist, right?
Yeah.
He knew because he was an architect or something. Like I said, I'm not a nuclear scientist, but they had a little robot that had a laser on it that was going to be able to cut the cables to scram it and everything like that. So 10K went in with him. They very quickly developed a relationship, right? That, 10K really kind of bought into his sort of style, right? And demeanor. And I thought that was really neat because I think that one, it highlighted that sometimes you can have somebody that joins a team that's like a really great fit, like no work necessary. And if, not to foreshadow, right? But like if he would have probably made it through that whole mission and survived, I think he absolutely probably could have been a member of that team, been super effective and had a lot of value added to the team. Because I think sometimes professionally and just in life, sometimes things just click with no effort whatsoever. And then you look at somebody like Murphy, who they tried to do that, try to use the robot, it failed. And then Murphy's like, well, what plan is this now? B, C, D, F. It starts reading off the alphabet. And Warren, like you said, really won't tolerate that kind of negativity, and was just like, it doesn't matter, right? It's got to get done, right? So whatever attempt we're on is somewhat irrelevant at this point. It needs to get done. And so, I think those were two really interesting pieces because Murphy's a member of the team who still is struggling to buy in, who's still struggling to fit in. So it's like you had a guy that's brand spanking new, perfect fit. People are listening to him. He's effectively moving with the team in the unit, gets the mission, happy to be. And then you have Murphy, who's well involved, well understood, been there, kind of the team was formed around him and still not really adapting. So I think that that's really telling of life almost. Like sometimes it just works and sometimes it takes a lot of work, but either way, you still got to get the mission done.
Agreed. And I think too, to your point of some people just fit into the team so well, it was also this whole we're here to help you, what is it that's important to you? Him, disabling that piece of equipment was really important. He saw the value in that. And they were like, we can help you with that. Now, along the way, they get their own needs met too, but it was like, sometimes, like I've said before, like what's important to the other person, what does support and what does success look like? And if you can understand that, it's very easy to get someone on your team. And then, yeah, with the whole Murphy thing too, I think it's like if we look back at the Tsunami episode, Warren listened to him when he pulled out that body bag for her to get into, because he wasn't dissenting. Not that dissent is negative or wrong, but it's like he was actively trying to problem solve. He wasn't just trying to be, for lack of a better word, pouty about it. Like he's just very pouts a lot. But that's just it. Whereas like when he was being an active, engaged team member and trying to problem solve with them, she didn't question what he was asking her to do, right? She took that, yes, I'll do that. I'll get into that. But like she was nervous about it, but it was probably more the situation than the suggestion. But yeah, but then it was like here where, again, he's not trying to be a productive member of the team. He's pouting.
No, for sure. I also think that like from a leadership perspective, when they realize that like their time was running out, that their attempts have been somewhat unsuccessful, I also think that, Warren's sort of looking ahead to, hey, Murphy's the main objective here. We're trying on this side thing, but maybe we need to, it's time for Murphy to go, right? And so getting him on the plane and getting him to a safer distance. So they didn't give up on that other goal, but they weren't letting it get in the way of what that main goal was. And I thought that was like really great as a leader, to, keep everything in perspective, right? As they were moving, right? So really balancing a lot of different like lines of effort and a lot of different goals. And I think she really did that, made like the best call that she could very effectively.
Agreed.
Yeah, so I think that was cool. I also think, problem solving skills came in there too, right? Using the vodka for the airplane fuel instead. I thought that was like really interesting. So there's a lot of really great things that came out of this episode.
Agreed. So then we move into the next episode, episode 11, Sisters of Mercy. And this brought about a lot of change for the team, a lot of like perspective taking. And again, what is a leader? We've encountered this so far with Tobias, with Jacob, with all different types of folks. And we have our core leaders who we're viewing as probably like the best version of what we would consider leadership. But then there's all these other people who kind of come along who seem to be in leadership type positions who, yeah, really just make you think differently and then challenge the leaders that we know. So what were some of your thoughts from the Sisters of Mercy episode?
I think that you have like an entirely now different leadership structure, so to speak, that you run into. And I think that was very interesting because what's the goal, right? The goal is that survival piece. And so people are all trying to get to that same end state through a lot of different paths. And so I think that's like really interesting. But what I find to be most fascinating is it seems like every single time we run into these other sort of like organizations that seem too good to be true, it's somewhat of a totalitarian like lead. It's not leadership, right? It's dictatorship. And I just think that that's always like really interesting, that the cost of that survival, that cost of that safety, comes at the complete loss of psychological safety, and normally some other like kind of wild like left field thing, like like those boys going to visit their father, so to speak. Like I just it blows my mind that that's always where it ends up, and we very rarely see, not since the major, kind of a safe society that's still working somewhat democratically.
Yes. And it goes to that whole point too of, I know I've said it before, but the means justify, or the ends justify the means. But also this piece of, even though it's different, society is different. The humanity piece of like, is it moral and is it ethical? Not necessarily based on like a dogma or anything, but just like, is this like the right thing to do? Is this the right way to treat people? And what I thought was so interesting about this episode, with it being this like self-sustaining woman, female only, I should say, type of place, there is also this element that they leaned into of safety, right? Safety from, in this case, it was safety from men and all the things that men do to society and do to women and all of that. And yeah, it was, I think the reason why I just even viewed this differently, and I'll say it is because I do identify as a woman. And it's that piece of like, I could almost get it, right? And then it just made me think like, would I fall into a cult? Probably not. But that piece though of when people are saying that kind of stuff and like justifying that, you're like, yes, because it's so hard to explain a lived experience to someone else. And I know we'd mentioned that before. But what is also super interesting was in saying, hey, men do all these things, and like they did in this episode, they were also demonstrating those same behaviors, right? In the way that they decided to seek justice for the women in their compound. So
Yeah.
Helen's a super interesting person in a positional type leadership.
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, like so the two big things that I also really got from this were, one, we saw like kind of this Warren being put in this position of like balancing like the needs of an individual for the betterment of the group, right? So with Cassandra having that like infected wound on her leg, right? She could assess that this, right, she got bad vibes, so to speak, right? A bad gut instinct, and thought that maybe they should go when they found out that the boys were going to see their fathers in Salt Lake, and I think it was Salt Lake, right? But were ultimately just being kicked out of the community, that they knew they needed to leave, but they also realized that she was not healthy enough, right, to leave. So they were staying in danger to try to get up a teammate who had more value. So it was kind of that risk reward, if you will. And then so I thought that was pretty interesting. And then I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, because my next point I want to bring up, but I don't want to jump too far ahead.
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, so with that, I'll say that I agree that, but what I thought was so genius about it too was there was this limit. Both Helen and Warren put parameters around it.
Yeah,
In
that's
24 hours, we will help you do this, and then you will leave. So it was like, it wasn't like, are we going to stay? Are we going to? So I think that was also helpful. And I think when we as leaders can do that for other people and just be very clear about boundaries and what they are, that sets people up for success. Because then it was like, even though there were bad vibes, it was like, okay, we know we're getting this, but we also know we have to leave at some point. We can't stay. So agreed.
Yeah, that's such a good point that they did put those boundaries on there, because then the next thing was when that I thought was the most interesting was, I think this is the first time that we started to address like burnout in like, so with Addie, and I very much viewed that, so that heart to heart that she was having with Helen, right, the leader of that community. You had somebody who'd been working really hard on this shared mission, had run into some stuff, and Warren really in the beginning was like a lot more supportive, right? She because she hadn't gone through, they had all gone through a lot, right? But like even when you looked at the family, like so earlier on with the whole like, we need to go back and get Cassandra, and Warren's like, yes, you don't understand, right? It's a woman thing. Like that has slowly started to peter out, at least from what we can view as the audience. And you've seen Addie going through more and more like trauma. Some of it could be completely unknown to Warren, and most of it was. And that's, we've already kind of talked about that, right? That you don't always know everything. But what I thought was really interesting was you have a team member who's reaching that burnout point, and now you have this other entity or organization. They're dealing with the same things, right? They're dealing with the same issues by another name, right? It's all still zombies. It's all still find food and survive, but is able to start to draw that team member away because you can always paint the grass as greener on the other side sort of picture. And so I thought that was really interesting about, keeping up with your team and knowing what they're going through and understand what they're going through, because when Addie starts to approach Warren and is like, I'm going to stay, I'm done, whatever. Right. Mac, like we talked about before, losing a team member, maybe just losing one means you lose two because you have that piece there, but it also took her totally by surprise. And I'm sure many things in her head, she'd already factored Addie into, right? Missions, problems, solutions to things moving forward that haven't even happened yet. So I thought that was like really interesting, that we start to see burnout and break out of the team.
And I don't mean weakness in a negative way. We all have these moments and these times of weakness. And that's what made Addie such a great mark for Helen, was that she was weak. She could be manipulated. She could be brought into the group, into Helen's group easily. And also like leaning on some of the stuff that Addie told her, right? Which is, of course, what the worst leaders do. They learn your secrets and then they use them against you for, their own gains. But you also mentioned something else in there, that like that checking in. So yeah, so as leaders, we do need to check in. Something Warren did throughout the whole episode was like, they went off to find those men, those bandits or whatever. So all the women were in the trucks leaving the compound. But then when they came back, Warren jumped out and like gave everybody kind of like an update on what was happening. So I loved too that she was also, I understand you can't come in there, and being out here, it feels like you're in this black box, not knowing, do we stay? Do we go? Like they heard that it was 24 hours, but at the same time, like what is going on? And so her being so communicative to be like, I need to tell them what's going on, keep them in the loop. I thought that was really valuable too.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And then like we talked about this before. I think even in just like, within that nuclear scene though, they had a goal, they had something they needed to do, and they were able to now mesh in with that group pretty effectively. And I think that always just goes to speak that like sometimes that understanding what that shared goal is, right? The larger picture makes working together a lot easier. So being like, as a leader, being transparent and the goals, being transparent in timelines, in everything, and the why behind stuff really makes it easier for a team to work effectively together with others or just themselves. So I think that was also pretty interesting.
Yes, absolutely. And it was also she is a good member of the team, but I felt like also in this episode we got to see Cassandra also doing like just kind of that recon, making sure she kept Warren up on what she was hearing and what she was learning. And again, that's on Warren to create that psychological safety, which she did. And so that information, it was like, it was just interesting because it's like all these things, team members need to be taken care of. So yes, our men will stay outside, will come in so that Cassandra can get the care that she needs. Yeah, we're doing that. And then that reciprocity that comes with being on a great team, not necessarily expected, but also kind of, because it is a transactional relationship, but that of here's information that I learned that's going to help us, right? So she's the one who figured out why the boys were leaving at age 13 and all of that kind of stuff. And then also when Warren went in and she was like, we're leaving, there was not a question. Cassandra was up. She was like, yep, let's go. So it wasn't like but what has it been 20? There was no question. So I think that there's this great trust too in Warren having stepped back into that leadership role.
Yeah. And then I think when Mac goes and when Addie decides she's going to stay and Mac's like trying to run after her to get her, right, and gets like slightly emotional because there is like a heavy emotional connection between them, and then gets shot at by the group. They secure him for his safety and then try to leave, and he jumps out of the car and points the gun at Warren and all that, and it's just like that level, like, okay, you can go now, but like that's sort of letting those emotional things like kind of really creep in there. I thought that was like a really sort of interesting ending because he, said buzz off to like her leadership to the mission and place like her over the mission. And that's also the first time where you see that sort of start to take place too, where Murphy may be the group's prime mission, but it's not my own. And I think it's always important to remember that with the team, with everyone else, like they have their own goals outside of the mission, right? So like they have their own things that they want to accomplish in life. So I thought that was pretty interesting too, because Warren was just like, okay, go, but we're not. We tried. We can't go back, right? Because this is still what the team is trying to do. So best of luck in your future endeavors.
No, I love that. I mean, I hadn't thought about that, but yeah, I appreciate that because also sometimes somebody leaves a company and they take some of their friends with them, right? They take some of their team members with them, and that just happens. There's nothing we can really do to prevent that. So, but yeah, that's such a great perspective. I love it.
Oh yeah, but I think it was a really good episode. I think it was really interesting. I also think that um sort of like playing around with the gender role thing and like its continued existence in this post-apocalyptic world where now it should be very easy just to be like humans against zombies, and yet we're still subcategorizing things. I thought that was really interesting because I think no matter how much you try to like I think organizations doing a better job of not trying to be like sterile about those topics and be more inclusive and open to the conversations and experiences of a workforce. I think it's really interesting that sometimes those not sometimes they still exist, right? Those sort of different people view people differently based on certain parameters. Um, and I think that's really I think is really interesting. That they chose to also still highlight that in this like post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah. I'm just thinking.
Sorry.
You're good. No, you're good. It's I think something that I appreciate about it is that a lot of times, most times throughout history, when a story is told, it just is told from a male's perspective. So I think that what I appreciate about this is that it's like the apocalypse didn't just happen to men, it happened to women, it happened to children, it happened to everyone. And I think that in the real world, not our world, in their world, like the real world, historically, we forget that wars also happen to women and that wars also happen to children, and that there are all these other perspectives and stuff that come into play because just historically it's been told from typically a single demographic. And so, yeah, so I think that's something that I do kind of appreciate about it because the experience is different for everyone, not just because of who we are, but there are these other things. The way that we present in the world physically does matter in ways that it shouldn't, right? Like it shouldn't, like you said, like we're a bunch of people in this situation, there are a bunch of people trying to fight zombies and like stay alive. But then there are these things where you're like, oh, okay, so like yeah, gender does matter, race does, but like these things matter. So yeah, so I think it's such an interesting I guess I appreciate the call outs that it's like, yeah, this is a holistic experience.
Absolutely. Got too heavy there, but I just want to say that we also see Zombie Bear in this episode, right? So far we've seen zombie dogs and zombie bears. So we will also have to see if only mammals can be zombies, because that's all we've seen so far. So just throwing that out there, right? Just another thought that runs parallel to this leadership journey.
I love it. I love it.